Thank you all. It is perhaps by design that we have heard from a multitude of voices over the last day and a half. We've heard from researchers and regulators, ethicists, advocates, and industry, and these categories are not mutually exclusive. We're about to hear from someone who describes himself as a once and perhaps future cowboy, falconer, and zookeeper. He also happens to be a physician and associate professor of environmental and occupational health at the University of Washington School of Public Health, where he directs the Center for One Health Research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Rabinowitz.
Your slides are up. Could you tell me how to work the slides here? They are, it's a very dark screen. Great, and just advancing, great. So thanks a lot, Megan, and thanks to Joanne and all the conference organizers. It's what I'm going to try to do in the next 20 minutes or so is try to really tie together some of the things that have happened in this conference and give a perspective of it coming from some of the work we've been doing out in Seattle at the University of Washington and think about where things could go and where some efforts could go. I think here there's an interest in pushing some of these things along and talk about that. So I'm going to do my best to try to summarize some really amazing and diverse presentations. And because of travel constraints, I wasn't able to hear all the presentations, so it's also been an interesting challenge for me to look at the slides on Dropbox and try to understand what everybody was doing and see what the common linkages were. But I'm going to get into it and try to really end up by really talking about kind of coexistence between humans and animals in a public health context, which I think is really one of the focus points of this thing. So the conference really started with a charge from Dr. Rowan to think carefully about costs and benefits in terms of health for numbers of different categories of animals, looking at companion animals, farm animals, lab animals, and wild animals, and really saying, you know, what are the positive parts of health related to these different categories, and what are some of the real costs, and how do we balance those and look at those? And as part of that, saying, you know, if there's a lot of questions about how to balance these costs, is there a need for a real academic focus and an academic center about animals in public health, and what should that kind of center look like? So then the conference moved on to really look at the issue of animal models and animal research, and the fact that while animals were important to drug development, our current approach to drug development is really considered to be unsustainable. It costs too much, and there's really a consideration about how good our translational models are. Are they really relevant? Are they reproducible? Are we getting bang for buck for all the animal work that we're doing, and what are the ethical implications of that? Is it possible that with all our emphasis these days on rodent-based models, that actually large animals may be better than models than small animals for humans than small animals in certain situations? And is there a speciesism about our reluctance to use our large animals compared to smaller animals? And I think there was a mention of something that I think other speakers touched on, which is that the use in animal and biomedical research of naturally occurring animal models is still underutilized. The fact that many animals get diseases that are very similar to humans, and we can learn a lot by studying those natural diseases in the animals without having to do actual experiments on them. And another point was that if we did sort of better pre-animal research in drug development and other parts of biomedical research, we wouldn't have to use animals as much. And so what are ways that we can continue to reduce the use of animals for that? Moving on to sort of animals and cancer, this was an extension of this idea that animals really do get cancers that are very similar to human cancers, and we can learn a lot from the genetics of the animals. In terms of dog breeds, dogs tend to be very diverse in the way we've bred them to different breeds, but each breed has a lot of homogeneity that gives us an interesting ability to look at particular gene-environment interactions for particular cancers and learn things that are really hard to learn in human populations and hard to learn in laboratory models of cancer. So should we be doing much more looking at these natural diseases in dogs to learn about cancer and other diseases in humans? And that was that was built on by more examples of glioblastoma in dogs and how there's really a promising clinical model in dogs of glioblastoma for humans, but it brought up the fact that we still don't know nearly as much about a lot of clinical issues in dogs, or I mean in animals in general, than we do in human health because of just the amount of resources that have been put into researching human diseases rather than animal diseases. And if we increase the amount of knowledge of animal diseases and do more types of clinical trials that are really often partnered with human trials, is there kind of a win-win situation we can have with animal studies where we have better models, we have studies that actually treat dogs with cancer, and that's good for the dogs, and it's also good for the owners. It's giving them hope. So is there a whole other way we can look at animal research in a much more sort of naturalistic way and less laboratory-based, but more clinically based, that could be a way forward as we look at animal research in the future? And there was a real talk about, not considering animals always as models, but considering them as patients. So that's really, again, the same theme. And to not only consider that the animal is a good model for a particular molecular pathway, but that actually it is a whole animal and they get whole diseases, and we should really realize that the animals are variable and we should embrace those differences and use that scientifically, but also realize that the differences between animals and people is not always an impediment, and it can actually be an advantage sometime when you're trying to understand particular aspects of disease. Having a comparative approach can actually shed light on those kind of things, and that we can progress to using biomarkers in animals that are exposed to particular environments to better understand what in the environment triggers disease, and ideally, how do you prevent it by doing that? And so again, greater use of these spontaneous disease models in animals. So the next session really got into this whole issue of animals as food and how does that relate to public health. And again, going back to the idea about costs and benefits, there was a lot of discussion of the costs of animal food production and the fact that the more we learn about eating a lot of animal protein or animal fat and what it does to chronic disease, we're thinking this is maybe not such a good idea. We really want to reduce the amount of animal food in the diet if we could. And we think that the way we're growing all these animals to feed the world is something that's driving a lot of things like diseases, including antibiotic resistance, and that also animal food production is a major contributor to environmental problems like climate change, greenhouse gas, and deforestation. So there's a lot of costs there in animal health, animal food production, and the benefits are that there is nutritional value, obviously, and as we talked about this morning, there are some populations for which animal protein, animal food sources are some of the most important and hard to replace types of nutrition. So it's this cost-benefit trade-off, and it's really seems like if we could somehow eat less animal protein or animal food source in general, we might be doing things that are good for land use, good for water, good for greenhouse gas, good for the environment, and it would, if we could change diets in some way and become more vegetarian, realizing how hard it seems to be to do that, maybe that would be more sustainable and equitable in some way. There was just more discussion of these costs of food production. There was antibiotic resistance was gone into in some depth. The zoonotic diseases that flow between humans and animals and how they've been the source of many important human diseases over time, and the major source now of emerging diseases, infectious diseases in humans, is related to animal food production in many ways, and that basically genes and pathogens in a globalized world are just going back and forth between humans and animals. And Dr. Silbergeld really brought up the fact that if the animals are not safe in the agricultural production, then the workers, who often are totally left out of the equation when you think about food production, are also not safe, and the food's not safe. So a lot of costs to animal food production if you really want to sit there and balance the costs and the benefits. And then Dr. Fraser, when looking at intensified agriculture, wonders, are we just going through the Industrial Revolution again, Or should we think about this in a different way and realize that people taking care of animals on farms are not like people in a factory, really, and the animals are not like widgets in a factory. The people in a factory are only there for 8 hours a day. The animals are there all the time, and that we should think maybe more about professionalism when we deal with animals in all these different contexts, including agriculture. And the third session was really getting into this issue of infectious diseases, zoonotic diseases going between animals and humans, and the cost and the burden of zoonotic disease, the huge cost of recent outbreaks of zoonotic diseases like we've seen around the world with Ebola and MERS and SARS, and how the efforts by projects like the PREDICT Project USAID to go out and find hundreds of novel animal viruses that especially seem to be in non-human primates and bats with the potential to cross over to humans in the future and cause serious outbreaks and pandemics is something that we're just still learning more and more about. But as we do that, Dr. Mazet talked about the importance of a One Health approach where you have to think about why this is all happening and what are the linkages between the humans and the animals and the environment, and what is driving the emergence of these zoonotic diseases that are all kind of very scary, and there's more of them than we ever thought there were. And to do that, all the things that we should be doing more to be aware of what's out there in the animals, to be doing more surveillance, to be doing more prediction of where the next disease is going to come from and how do we do the prevention. Influenza is a perfect example of how a virus can mutate quickly and move between animals and people. And Dr. Vincent really talked about a new aspect of influenza that we don't always think about, which is how often humans are giving influenza to pigs, and how the dynamics of influenza moving around the world really involves a lot of people giving disease to animals, and then animals sharing it and then giving it back to people. And there's much more crossing back and forth than we ever sort of thought before. And as we do that, we really have to do, again, more surveillance of the animals to better understand what's happening and how do we get vaccines that ideally could help both people and animals. So again, this idea of mutual benefit of doing a better job here. We can protect the pigs as well as the people, and that if we're trying to understand a human disease like influenza, where we've used ferrets for a long time as an experimental model, pigs in swine barns are probably a much better model in many ways, sort of a naturally occurring model of what's going on for influenza than ferrets are. And we heard from government regulatory people about the role of FDA, USDA, Fish and Wildlife Service, and other regulatory agencies, that what they're doing to try to handle the issues of animal disease, that it's important for the animals, but also a threat to human health potentially. And some of the public health terms that are used sometimes in public health control activities, but are certainly used for animal disease control activities, terms like surveillance, inspection, detention, quarantine, and destruction are some of the terms that have to be used when these agencies are out there trying to control exotic foreign animal diseases and things like that. And also how FDA is working to ensure that the drugs we give animals are safe for the animals, and that there's a good lab network to track animal diseases and ideally have relevance both for animal disease but for human disease as well. So all the kind of very public health type activities that are going on for animal health that really overlap with what we're doing for human health. And the final session this morning went over the ethics of the human use of animals, and the first talk really talked about how pain is much more appreciated in animals and controlled than it was several decades ago, but that we really are still not doing a very good job of appreciating and respecting the animalness or the nature, the telos of an animal, and that we still are doing things to prevent noxious stimuli, but are we really considering the whole situation when we deal with animals? And Dr. DeGrazia talked about, is there some way to have common ground between biomedical research with animals and animal protectionists? Can we sort of find some way to agree to move beyond the 3 R's of refinement, reduction, and replacement, this idea of intermediate moral status, is that a way forward? And that can these considerations of things like worthwhile life, avoiding unnecessary harm, and being pretty stringent about justifying benefit of research, is that going to be a way to really look more at animal research in the future? So, and then Dr. Herzog, really, I've heard him before, and it was great to hear again how we make no sense when we talk about animals, and we're just not consistent. There's evolution and an emotion going on, and I think really important to remember how emotion drives a lot of our ideas, and then we rationalize it, and that social psychology, and I think anthropology as well, needs to come into certainly any discussion of animals and public health as well, and realizing that we're just not consistent, and culture and evolution play a big role. So I think an amazing spectrum of opinions and ideas and thoughts about where we're going with animals. And the question that I sort of wanted to pose is how do, and it was really brought up by one of the questioners recently about people around the world are starving. What about the animals? What should a school of public health like Bloomberg School here do about animals and public health? And can we sort of all get along on this planet? And I think there was some slides about how many animals there were in the world, but I think it's useful to look chronologically at what's been going on for populations. So we spend a lot of time in public health thinking about how many people there are in the world, and you can see sort of the line in the middle showing the human population over time and how we're moving up toward 9 billion people in the next couple of decades, which is a lot of people. But if you see that 50 years ago, we were about the same level of chickens in terms of our population. And in the last 50 years, the chickens have done a lot better than we have, if you want to look at a numbers game. They've increased by 5 or 6 times over the past 50 years. There's more than 24, 25 billion chickens in the world at any one time. And that's a lot of animals, and there's still plenty of cows and pigs and other animals. But the fact is that our population increase has not just gone by itself. Animal populations have increased with us, and we're really now in a very crowded world with a lot of animals, and we have to think about how we're going to get along. And the idea of looking at cost and benefits, I think, is very important, but there's also a bit of a problem from a public health perspective that I want to talk about, and I think I'm also the only physician who's spoken at this conference. And so when you think about companion animals, there's things like the human-animal bond, which sounds sort of great, but the science isn't great about it. And then there's these sort of nasty ideas about zoonoses and injuries, which sound pretty bad. When it comes to food animals, nutrition sounds good, but then we hear that it's really not that good for you to eat too much of it. So don't overdo it with the animal food. And then we think about all the downsides of food animals: antibiotic resistance, environmental damage. And then we hear with lab animals that they're not great as models for human disease, and there's a lot of ethical issues to use them. So I'm just not sure the benefits really outweigh the costs. So looking at costs and benefits this way kind of puts people and animals at opposition. And I think that what we fall into, and I'll say this as a physician, is kind of an us versus them perspective about animals, which is that animals are kind of nasty. They bite you and they give you diseases, and they just they poop a lot, and there's just a lot of problems with animals and I think that if possible, what public health has done and what medicine usually does is say sort of keep the animals away, and if possible kind of minimize them and get rid of them. If I'm a physician and someone has immunodeficiency in the house, I tell them to get rid of the iguana. If the kid has asthma, we say get rid of the cat. One of the major public health things measures that took place at the sort of the beginning of modern public health was to go into cities where there were a lot of animals. There were horses all through New York City. There was manure piling up in the street. There were chickens everywhere in these cities. And the first thing that public health did was ban animals from cities and just say, let's get rid of them. It's really kind of us versus them. The cities are a place for people. We don't want a lot of animals there. They just cause a lot of problems. And so it's very easy in public health and medicine to sort of say, you know, animals, I'm just not sure the benefits are worth the cost, and sort of can't we just sort of, you know, cut down our use of food animals? Can't we sort of get rid of lab animals sometimes? And there's obviously, you know, very good reasons to make those cost-benefit comparisons, but it ends up sort of saying that in general, animal things are something we'd rather sort of get rid of if we could. And what I'm sort of proposing is the idea of really focusing in the future on all the shared health issues with animals, that we're really on this planet together. The animals are not going away. We're not going away. What are the ways that we can have shared health efforts that do a lot of the things that were talked about at this conference? The comparative clinical research, treating animals like patients, taking naturally occurring animal diseases, doing a better job, matching the expertise of human medicine and veterinary medicine together to find solutions that benefit both animals and people. It's a win-win situation. Can we look at more of these win-win sort of shared situations? The human-animal bond is another one, but we think that it's good for people to have pets, but there's also a need to consider that not every animal who's brought into a hospital to do animal-assisted therapy is actually enjoying that, and there's some serious animal welfare or possible rights concerns about what we do with animals and human-animal bond that should be considered, but it's generally a potential win-win situation that we should make the most of. And then I think as we learn more about things like the microbiome, we realize that when you live in a house with animals, you're actually sharing a lot of the bugs in your own body with those animals, and they're sharing their bugs with you. And it's not necessarily a nasty zoonotic disease. It's actually potentially beneficial. And this kind of sharing, this sharing of bacteria and other things about our health is something that we really could make a lot of. And in my field, which is occupational environmental medicine, we've known for a long time that animals are the canary in the coal mine, and that they are not only, as we heard in this conference, potentially identifying important environmental triggers for cancer or other diseases, they are really telling us that the environment is really changing, and we are in the midst of you know, standing sort of with the animals in the face of this huge amount of climate change and other environmental change that's going on. And that zoonotic diseases, which traditionally we think about as this sort of nasty thing that if we could only keep the animals away from us, we'd take care of, is really not all the, it's really hurting the animals too in many cases. Ebola virus wiping out great apes in West Africa, just as it has caused incredible outbreaks in people. The largest, I don't know how many people know that this last year was the largest animal health crisis in the history of the United States, and it didn't even make the news, even in Washington State, where we were having a pretty good sized outbreaks of avian flu coming through that killed 50 million animals before it was done in the summer, and we're expecting more of these kind of outbreaks. So the animals are not enjoying these diseases either, and they're really happening because our shared environment is being really affected by all the environmental change, the deforestation, the climate change, the intensification of agriculture. This is something that is not always good for animals either. And so we really have a shared risk, not just a sort of an us versus them situation. So how do we move from us versus them to kind of this shared idea that animals can tell us about the environment, they can be canaries, that we share exposures, that we share potential health win-win benefits? I do think that the One Health model, which is really a systems-based model and says, you know, we've got the humans with really a system going from very simple aspects to complex aspects of the human health system. We're really interacting at different levels with animals who also are basically systems of molecules all the way up to the global fauna. But we're both interacting with the environment at different levels, at a very chemical and physical level, at the microbiome level, at the built environment that we're sharing, and then at the sort of the global planetary level about all the populations of animals on Earth and the humans. And I think One Health, which has done a lot of work just on the zoonotic diseases, really can be expanded to look in a systems way at these kind of interactions. And I think that that should really be considered when we try to really consider animals in public health, is how do you take this kind of systems approach, because these are very complex systems and we're dealing with complex events that are happening in the world, and the animals are helping tell us kind of what's going on, and we should listen to them, I think. And so in agriculture, can we have kind of a One Health approach to agriculture where we do the best job we can to have the animals, and I'm saying be healthy, and I'm not a philosopher, so I think we have to consider all the issues of rights and welfare, but basically find some way to talk about well-being and health for the animals, as well as the people who are working with the animals in an agricultural system, and are we trashing the environment as we do that kind of agriculture? So can we create a sustainable model for agriculture that considers public health, animal health, and the environment at the same time? In a city, remember, we tried to get rid of all the animals. Well, they came back. Now we have, I don't know about Baltimore. Do you have chickens in Baltimore? So in Seattle, you can now have 8 chickens, no rooster. You can have 2 goats. So urban farming is coming back in a big way. And worldwide, people keep animals in cities, and it's something we have to learn how to really coexist in a city. In Seattle, we have more dogs than children in the city. People do treat dogs like part of their family, and we have to figure out how to deal with that without also going crazy with it. And we also are creating this whole sort of class of commensal animals that absolutely love being around people and are there because there's so many people around. So the reason there's so many crows is that they love where people live, and so do rats, and so do deer. And increasingly in Asia and other places, monkeys are the same way. They are simply part of living in a city. And how are we going to deal with that? Are we just going to get rid of them all, which is sort of a traditional public health approach, or are we going to find some really good way to coexist? I think that's a public health challenge, and it's a One Health challenge, and I think we need to really look at that kind of thing. And one thing I didn't hear about at this conference is we deal with the environment and all the climate change and all the disasters that are happening with various with hurricanes and tsunamis and things like that, is that in a disaster response, if you don't coordinate your public health effort with your animal health effort, you're going to have a real problem. In Katrina and many other disasters, people do not leave their house if there's an animal there that they don't have a way to get out of there. It really affects your public health disaster response, and we have to do what we're starting to do is really joint planning between human and animal health and these kind of public health things, which is really, again, sort of a One Health effort. So I think there is a need for academic leadership and more centers that really look at this thing, and I think it's fantastic that a public health school is trying to do something like this, and I have some experience to share from trying to start things in a public health and medical school in Seattle, but I really think that to get beyond this us versus them oppositional dichotomy that we easily fall into, and traditionally that's what medicine and public health have done, to look at shared health and sustainable coexistence. And so I think I'll stop there and really look forward to further discussions with all of you. Take care.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I'm Aisha Akhtar. I work at the FDA, but I'm representing myself. I'm also a physician. I'm a neurologist, and I have an MPH. And I really appreciate your trying to help us get beyond the us versus them, because as you mentioned, that has been the traditional view in public health and medicine towards other animals. And so one question I have, and this is something I argue in my book, I actually wrote a book on animals and public health, and what I find with the One Health approach is while I appreciate many aspects of it, I feel that it still fundamentally neglects the fundamental question, which is, aren't many of these problems that we're seeing now, don't they go back to our fundamental relationship with animals? We talk about zoonoses, we talk about the environmental degradation, we talk about poor animal models and so on and so on. And I find that that discussion still tends to be lacking. I mean, we talk about Band-Aid fix, maybe have a vaccine for pigs in industrial farms, but we don't really address the fundamental nature of how we view these animals, how we relate with them. And so I'd like to hear your comments on that. Thank you.
So tell me how you think One Health doesn't do that, because I think that's important to talk about?
So there's a lot of emphasis on surveillance, and I agree. I mean, surveillance is one of the things I do. It's one of my jobs, and I agree that there is a necessity for it. But as you can probably understand, there's a lot of limitations with surveillance. Political boundaries, private industries don't want to let us know what's going on in their industries, and so on and so on. And plus, there's many complications with diagnosing diseases and predicting which zoonotic infections will ultimately reach humans. So, for example, when the Ebola epidemic raged last year in Western Africa, I saw pretty much no discussion from public health about the fact that much of it, whether that particular epidemic stemmed, we don't know exactly how that stemmed, but much of it is related to the bushmeat trade. And there was a lot of discussion about surveillance, about having vaccines and what drugs and so on, but very little discussion about the actual wildlife trade of animals.
Yeah.
And so I felt that we dropped the ball in public health.
Well, I think we did somewhat of a typical response. Was, first of all, once it got really bad in the human population, it was an overwhelming, the public health system fell apart, and people had to go in there and try to salvage the public health situation. I don't think there was a lot more that could be done and to really look at what was the drivers in that situation for this kind of outbreak. The data was not recorded at the time of all this response that could have been recorded. I think that we have to change the way we look at these problems, and I think we've made a lot of progress in putting multidisciplinary teams together, but I don't think we're there yet. But I think I can't see any other way to go than to have to consider these complex problems from a couple different perspectives and bring those kind of teams together. I just don't think we're going to solve them any other way.
Peter, thank you for a really nice summary and pulling it all together. Question that arose to me, with the sharing of the microbiome between animals and humans living together, have there been any studies that look at the human health of people living with companion animals versus those that don't?
Is Dr. Morris here? You want to just mention the effects on human health of sharing with an animal in the house in terms of skin disease?
I'm Dan Morris. I'm a veterinary dermatologist at Penn, and with Megan, we kill bazillions of staph and Pseudomonas very happily and morally in labs. We've been asking the question if the microbiome of pets has a protective effect against staphylococcal infections, and I think allergen development as well. And so that data is still fairly new, and we're working through the publication processes. But the answer is likely that because dogs harbor a different species of Staphylococcus than people, and there's interspecies staphylococcal competition in niches where we would be colonized, that living with dogs may truly have a protective effect against the acquisition of MRSA infections in people. But I don't think our data is robust enough yet to draw that conclusion completely. So, as you know, we're forging on.
Going back to the One Health and the fact that it hasn't really penetrated, I still see it. I've been hearing about One Medicine or One Health since I started in this field in 1970.
Yeah.
And it still keeps going on. And yet this global conference on One Health that was held, I think, in Japan this year,
Amsterdam,
or Amsterdam. There were four talks on disasters, One Health and disasters. And as far as I can see, none of those talks mentioned animals. And yet, when we respond to disaster situations as an animal protection group, we're out there helping the people and their animals, because the animals are such a key part of their environment. And yet the disaster community, as a community, has not even got a sniff of the animal side of the issue.
Yeah, well, I think, again, we've got a long way to go. I think in Washington State, we're certainly coordinating disaster response. I think after Katrina, there were different regulations that were put into place that if you make a human shelter, you have to make an animal shelter at the same time. I think we are starting to realize how important it is, but many times the animal response is better than the human response. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Parcell, and I'm from K-State University at the Olathe campus, and I'm in charge of a project that deals with developing a veterinary clinical trial network in the animal health corridor. So we're really taking a One Health approach to this, and I'm really thrilled to see you talking about using systems thinking and a systems approach to try and create these sort of integrative implementations. And I'm wondering if you would expand a little bit more on what you guys are doing in Washington and your thoughts about how using systems and systems thinking for implementations of One Health can happen and occur.
Well, I'll just throw out an idea we had that I'm sure some people could critique mercilessly here. But we're thinking that one of the things we've done for sustainability with building is to look at the lead approach to building, sort of a checklist of, are you doing all these kind of sustainable things when you build a building? And it can be a big building or it can be a small building. But the idea is that you're going to consider sustainability from a bunch of different perspectives when you build a building. You're going to look at whether you recycled the materials, and what did you do with the building site, and how did you affect the environment around the building, and are you conserving energy? What's your carbon footprint, and all this kind of thing. We're wondering if you could put that kind of multifaceted checklist approach to something like dairy production, which is creating animal milk protein for many hungry mouths around the world, but it also has a large environmental footprint, and the workers have a lot of very unique occupational risks, and it's got a big impact on the rural communities where the farms are going on. Could you try to, and so what happens sometimes is people say, well, small farms are better. We should all have farms with 10 cows, and the cows are happy. They're out in the field. Is that, and these big farms now, we have 5,000, 10,000 cows, must be terrible, and the animal welfare must be terrible. Is that always, is there any way to put things on a level playing field so that you really say, let's take a look at a farm, and it could be a small farm or a large farm, but how are you doing with the animal health? What is happening with your workers? What is your environmental, what's your real carbon footprint? Are you, in terms of the amount of greenhouse gases that you're emitting per gallon of milk, there's ways to calculate that, and what is the most environmentally friendly way to produce animal protein if we're going to do it? You could actually go out with sort of a rating system and do that with dairy, and we haven't done that with food very much. We've sort of said, well, I'm going to go to Whole Foods and pay a lot of money for grass-fed, or I'm going to do this one that says more humane, or I'm going to go and this one's natural and this one's organic, and we're sort of, as consumers, running around. We know nothing about what it takes to actually run a dairy and get cows to be milked all the time, and so we think that grass-fed must be better than corn-fed, and yet most of us, especially in public health, we know nothing about farming. And one of my first experiences with talking to veterinarians in public health was they said, please don't come near the farms because you public health people just screw it up all the time. So, but could we actually work as a team to go into a dairy system and say, is this a system that's really good for the environment? Is it good for the people? Is it good for the animals? How do we get this kind of win-win situation going on? So that's one project we've sort of started, is just talking to stakeholders about what would you assess? How do you put things on a level playing field about that and consider this kind of complex system from a bunch of different points of view, and ideally come up with some sort of rating scale that could educate consumers, which are going to be really powerful in the future at driving a lot of change. It's worked for antibiotics, it's worked, and it can work for other things as well, to really understand a little bit about what it takes to produce animal protein, and is there a way that's really sustainable when you look at all these different facets. That's one thing we're trying.
Thank you.
Carol Robertson-Plew with Eli Lilly. This is a comment as much as anything. I appreciate your wrap-up and rounding things all out. It was a really nice wrap-up session. This One Health notion of us all working together, I think, is really important for our future, and that we will do much better to work together between human medicine and animal medicine in the environmental area to move progressively forward than if we remain in our silos. And Even in industry, we respect this, we're embracing it, and we are also considering the balance of ethics and of ethics for humans as well as animals, as well as the environment, and how do we answer the unmet medical needs in humans across the world, whether it is lack of food or whether it is Ebola virus or whatever else it is. It's a complex world, and there are not simple answers, and it's by working together that we're going to get to those answers that matter.
So I don't think there's really a question there, and that's a great comment and probably a good way to actually wrap this up. I'm Derek Rachman. On behalf of my co-PIs, Joanne Zerlo and Jeffrey Kahn, we really appreciate everyone who's contributed as speakers, as well as in the audience asking really insightful questions as we try to move forward and decide how we're going to try to develop an institute to address these needs here through the School of Public Health, the School of Medicine, and the Berman Institute, and involve the rest of the university in this venture. So with that, I say safe travels home for those who've come from far away. We have some people that are going to stay and help continue this discussion in a closed-door session. If you don't know where you need to go, please talk to me. And could we have one final round of applause for all the speakers?